You are listening to ESL Talk, a podcast made for English teachers by English teachers.
Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of ESL Talk. I'm Faye.
And I'm Daniel. Today we're looking at the topic of translation and interpretation for the ESL classroom.
Not only does translation play a huge role in the processing of the English language, but how it is interpreted is also important too.
It is indeed. And with the Olympics now coming to a close, we're joined by our special guest, Aysel, who is a sports interpreter and translator from Russia. She'll share and highlight the importance of translation, as well as how this could be applied to the ESL classroom.
Yeah, it's great. So, Daniel, this is a topic we've touched on slightly on episode 12, but here we're focusing more on translation and how it is interpreted by learners as well, right?
Yeah, we are. So, Faye, I know you've kind of mentioned this a little bit before, but maybe you can tell us a little bit more about this. Have you ever worked with translation while you were in Brazil?
Yeah, actually, when I had just started out teaching, I also got approached by a couple of people because, I guess most people know now, I was born in Brazil and learned English there, but I was fluent, native-like fluent, let's say, very early. And it was kind of hard for people to find others to do translation work for them. So I actually started doing some translation work. I never did interpretation, nothing like live, but just written translation work. For a lot of doctors, because my father is a doctor, and I translated a few of his journal articles, and then for his colleagues as well, which was incredibly challenging, very niche and very specific vocabulary. But luckily, Portuguese is a Latin-based language, so a lot of the terms come from Latin for this field, so that made it a little bit easier. Now, what about for you, Daniel? Have you ever, in terms of teaching, experienced classrooms where translation was used or methodologies using translation?
Yeah, when I was teaching in South Korea, my initial teaching roles that I did out there, it was always taught with a Korean co-teacher. So a little bit of translation was used. It would depend on the ability of the students, and it would depend on who I was teaching with. Some of my co-teachers were very hands-on. They wanted to be really involved. So they would try to only use Korean when it was necessary, or just to kind of explain some concepts because the ability of the students was really low. So that was kind of useful at the middle school and high school level, where we're doing more technical tasks or maybe activities that have different processes to them. So that was really useful. However, I also worked in an elementary school for 2 years, and my co-teachers there were more just kind of like hands off, and they were like, oh, it'll be great for the students to just listen to your voice. So they played the role more of like just keeping the students in line, making sure they're sat in the right place and that they're focused, which was fine. So it kind of works both ways. So, and I sometimes as well would mix in, and I do still now mix in a little bit of Korean with my students who I'm teaching, maybe the younger ones, or whatever language it might be Portuguese or Mandarin Chinese or whatever it is. I might just throw that in just now and again if I have to, just to help. But what about you? What's your experience with this kind of environment?
Back in Brazil, there were lots of schools, really big chains whose methodology was the grammar translation method still, which is like from the 70s, right? Where you basically say a sentence in Portuguese and the students have to repeat it back to you in English. And then you say the sentence in English, the students have to repeat it back to you in Portuguese. And I'm not a huge fan of that method because that's not how our brain works. That's not how we communicate. And what ends up happening is you have students who always have that 5-second delay in their interactions because they listen and then they try to translate to Portuguese and then they translate what they want to say back to English. And it's very it's counterproductive, I find. And when I was actually looking for teaching positions, I purposely stayed away from those types of schools because it's really not, it kind of goes against what I believe in terms of teaching. But like you said, it can have its value. Like some translation can be helpful in some ways. Do you think this kind of strategy, like translation, can be useful for students who are trying to learn English, or do you think immersion only should be the way to go?
Again, I'm going to use the kind of the blanket answer. It depends on the student. I think if you have very young students who are just learning English, they're just getting familiar with it, then I think you have to help them slightly, because I've been in an immersion situation where I was learning Korean and it was no English, virtually zero. There was very, very minimal English. So it was really difficult because you're like, where's my safety net? Where's my structure? Where's my support?
Right.
And I think I learned more quickly in an immersion setting, but a lot more things didn't make sense, or I didn't understand, or I didn't have a reference point for them.
It's more stressful too, right? Because you feel like you don't know anything that's happening.
And as you mentioned before, with a lot of students I've worked with, Chinese students, Korean students, Japanese students, Iranian students, Brazilian students, they, like you said, they tend to just process it in their first language, then regurgitate it in English. And then that comes with all the different grammar errors, tense errors, pronoun errors as well connected.
Exactly.
So because they're not thinking in English, they're making a lot more errors. So I always try to teach my students to think in English. It's as easy as it sounds. I know it isn't, but I know. What are your thoughts on this?
No, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think it's, as a learner, we can understand how our students feel, because you do feel lost. If you don't have any knowledge of the language, and then you're suddenly thrown in the deep end and you have to understand what the teacher's saying. I mean, I did have a student once, I remember I was teaching elementary level, which has never really been my comfort zone, but there was a student from Saudi Arabia with whose English I would say was not even zero. It was real. I never had a student with this level of English before. And I was trying to explain the word picture to him. We were doing an exercise where you describe the picture. And, how do you explain the word picture? You point to a picture on the wall, right? So I pointed to this picture on the wall of like a forest, and I pointed to that, and I said, this is a picture. And then there was a tree in the course book we were using, and on the page, and he's like, oh, okay, picture, pointing to the tree. And I'm like, oh, I think he thinks picture is tree. So then I pointed to the other picture on the wall. I'm like, picture. And he's like, what? So to make a long story short, I ended up buying him an English Arabic dictionary. And I actually encouraged him to translate some of the keywords, because he had no way of understanding it. I mean, he could learn it, but it would take him so long to get there, especially for those words. So that was a bit of, I'd say, like a humbling experience for me, because I've always been a huge proponent of immersion only. But once we're adults and there's so many pressures and we have all of these filters already, and we already feel stressed out about learning a language, you feel like you're a child again, and it doesn't help if they're this stressed out and they don't have the support. So I do now believe that in certain situations at lower levels, like you said, when you're just starting out learning Korean or something, some translation can be helpful, but I also don't think it should be what students, let's say, lean into and what they count on, because it will end up hindering their communication, right?
So with your courses and the materials that you've been developing recently for Instagram, things like that, how do you help your students to interpret or understand the vocabulary or the material that you're trying to get across? Is it subtitles? Is it pictures? Is it, breaking words down into chunks? Is it all of those things?
Well, I think that especially because now I'm focusing on video content, I think it really helps to use body language, facial expressions, gestures. And now with technology, and like especially with Instagram and stuff like that, you can add little GIFs or GIFs, whatever you want to call it, or a picture or something, or an emoji or whatever, just to illustrate your point. It's just so much easier. Instead, in the past, I remember when I started teaching, I would print like countless flashcards and laminate them and reuse them. And I had a box of flashcards. You probably went through that too, right? And I think just making it visual, that's how we can get around that. What do you think? What are some of your ways of doing that?
I think visuals are probably the best way to do that, to get your picture across. No pun intended. But I think, definitely images, videos are really useful. Sounds, if it's something quite simple, can be really useful as well. Because what I always want to try to teach my older students is context, and linking a word or a phrase or an expression with a place. I think that really helps, or a situation. So I would definitely say sounds, videos, images. If it's longer words or phrases, connecting them to an experience that a student's had. So I'm like, oh, in this situation, you can say this, or in this situation, you could say that. That's really useful, that I found, because then they can tie it to something. So when they're in that situation, they can think, oh, I know what to say, or I know what question to ask. So I think that's really important as well. And sometimes because again, I have some students, it's wonderful where they still think or they're still speaking in their first language, and I can hear that.
Yeah.
But I'm just thinking, and I asked them, so what's your process? So identifying the process as well can be really nice to break down the steps and try to break down those steps in English as well. So those are some strategies that I use as well. All right, so now we're going to move on to the interview portion of today's podcast. We're going to introduce our guest, Aysel. So let's go over to today's interview.
Hi, Aysel. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really happy to have you here.
Hi, Faye. I'm really glad to be here, and thanks for inviting me.
Great. Well, first of all, we'd love to know, how did you get started in translation? Like, what was your initial motivation to work in this area?
When I was a school student, I was interested both in sports and languages, and I was learning French and English at that time. And I also used to play basketball. So there were my two passions, and I wanted to combine them. So that way I found a perfect area for me, sports translation. And I also liked the emotions that I saw from athletes when they were, I don't know, winning their games and gaining their trophies. I guess that's the best feeling. Yeah. So.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, it sounds like a very fulfilling profession. So, as you said, you specialize in sports translation for sport. How do you break into, or how do you kind of get into that field of work? Because it sounds quite specialist and quite niche.
Yeah, it all started in my childhood. I used to come after school. I wanted to watch cartoons like all children. And then my dad would come after his work, and he saw me watch cartoons, and he said, "Why don't you watch real stuff like sports?" And he used to turn on, sports channels, and I didn't want to watch them. But I decided to stay, and that's how it all started. And I started to love sports. And at university, there were different types of translation because I studied linguistics and translation. And we had different fields like medical translation, sports translation, or translation in general. And I realized that sports would be the best area for me.
Oh, so that's interesting. So there was actually a focus in your translation course just for sports.
Yeah.
It's really amazing. You had so much choice. Usually it's just kind of a general kind of catch-all course, but that's great that you had that variety. That's really awesome.
That was very cool.
And you also run a pretty successful Instagram account teaching sports vocabulary to people from all over the world, not necessarily because you're originally from Russia, right?
Yes.
But I think your audience is from all over the world learning vocabulary with you. Do you also teach English, or is that something you just wanted to do on Instagram?
It's something I wanted to do on Instagram because I wanted to, broaden the sports area, because there aren't many pages on Instagram that teach sports English. And it's actually not easy to grow on Instagram, because when you have a specific area, there aren't many people that are interested in sports than in general English. And sometimes I do teach English, but it's not my full-time job. And half of my students are actually athletes. And that's also a combination of sports and English. And I also have a friend. She went to the Olympics. She's in Tokyo right now. She's playing for for our team, water polo team.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So yeah, that's
And you helped her with, I guess, with some of the language, or
yeah, she was learning water polo vocabulary.
oh,
So when it comes to translation, Aysel, what are the aspects of translation that are the most enjoyable, and what are the most difficult aspects for you?
I guess the most enjoyable aspects are learning about sports, talking, because when you're interpreting, you're talking all the time, and getting to know new people. Because like 5 or 10 minutes before going onto the stage, you have to get to know the person, to know a little bit of his background or what he's doing, like what he does in his life and stuff. And I guess the most difficult is when people use idioms that don't exist in another language. And it's
But that's very common.
it's very difficult because you don't have a choice. You just translate the meaning in. You can't, use the idiom that exists in English or in Russian or in French, because I speak French as well. And sometimes there are people that realize that interpretation is very difficult, and they can, say like 1 or 2 sentences. They wait for you, you translate, you interpret, and then But sometimes there are people that talk a lot, like 10 sentences, and you're, oh my God. And you freak out because half of the sentences just disappear, and you have to, you just translate the general meaning of what the person says. That's, I guess that's the most difficult part of
that
interpretation.
sounds kind of stressful.
Yeah, definitely. You just reminded me
lot.
now of, especially in soccer and football, there's a lot of those kind of things, a lot of cliches. And there's actually the team that I support, the team that I follow, their manager has a translator, and he will say something really long and very complicated, and the translator will just say, yes, he's very happy. But he didn't say that. It's just, it's not possible to put that into English, right? So
yeah. That's so challenging.
Yeah, that's what we were taught at the university too. Yeah,
just give the general message, I guess.
Yes,
that kind of ties into the question I have for you, because I mean, languages are very tied in with culture, right? And do you find that there are a lot of these cultural differences between like Russian and English or Russian and French? And how does the cultural difference affect your work in terms of the translation? Because there are idioms, but there are also, I guess, intonation and jokes and things like that.
Yes, especially when we have an official dinner after a competition. There are people who, like to tell different stories, and they use a lot of jokes that people of other cultures won't understand. And in order to bring the balance, you look for different words or idioms in another language that will, have the same meaning, but just
same
in another
effect,
language.
kind of,
Yes. There aren't many cultural differences. Most of them are connected or related to grammatics, like gender, because in Russian we have 3 genders, or sentence structure. Or when I'm interpreting, I should wait for the whole sentence to see what they mean. Because in Russian, it's free. Like you can put a verb first or an adverb, whatever. Yes, it's not fixed at all. And when I translate to English, I wait for the Russian sentence, because I can't start the English sentence with the Russian order. So that's
really interesting.
That's very interesting to interpret. The main thing is that you have to know your vocabulary and the sport you're in. Yeah, because every time we have different sporting events, and it depends on the sports. For example, when we have technical meetings, and they, for example, ski world championship, and they discuss the tracks, the length of tracks, the, I don't know, technical characteristics of skis. And
Wow.
if you don't know this area, you're just sitting there knowing nothing.
Yeah.
And you can't translate anything.
Sounds like you have to be a real
Wow.
expert.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's true.
Yeah.
That's why, if I'm not familiar with any sport, for example, I don't know, in 2 weeks we're having billiards world championship. And to be honest, I don't know anything about billiards, so I should get familiar.
Have to study.
Yeah, a lot. And
Wow.
Yeah.
if we have it now, I wouldn't translate anything because I just don't know what that sport is. But as for skiing or ice hockey, and I'm also one of the announcers when we have ice hockey games. So
Oh, cool.
yeah.
Really cool. So let's really dig down now, see if you can define, because our listeners probably don't know, what exactly are the differences between translation and interpretation? What are the characteristics that make them different from each other?
The key difference between translation and interpretation is that interpreters, they translate everything in spoken language, and translators translate everything in written language. So interpretation is an oral form of translation, and translation is the written form. And also, there is not only just a word interpretation. You have a consecutive when you translate with 2 or 3 second gap. You're waiting for the person, and you translate everything after.
It seems like these words are interchanged and they're quite flexible, because you hear one person is a translator, but they're doing oral interpretation, whereas someone's interpreting and translating. So I see that. I think there's a little bit of confusion there.
Yeah, that's right. And a person should know the difference if they, make if they want to order a service of translation or interpretation. Because sometimes there is a misunderstanding. Yes, it's important to know the difference.
Yeah.
And in what ways do you think that translation can be helpful or useful for the ESL classroom?
I guess it can be useful when students can compare 2 texts in English or in Russian, for example, and they can see the sentence structure, the word order, and see what idioms or phrases are used. I guess, that's very practical during the lessons.
Okay. Do you find that it helps students if they're just like hearing something and then they try to translate to Russian and then translate it back to English?
Yes.
Do you have students who do that, and does that help them, you think?
When I teach athletes, I give some sentences, that are related to their sport, and I always try to make some sort of press conference. For example, there are famous athletes, and I'm one of the journalists, and I ask questions about their future career or their plans. And they try to answer, or I just give the sentence in Russian.
It's really interesting.
Because to me, it sounds like you had to study a lot to master this skill. But often we have students who want to speak English but also translate, and it seems like it's a lot to do, right? To become being a translator is a profession, right? So
yes, because you also
something
have to,
different.
You also have to have a cultural background, to know a lot of cultural differences, because sometimes you can just misinterpret, and that would lead to some catastrophe,
right,
and conflict between countries. And sometimes there are people that are talking to each other, and they don't know some cultural aspects, And sometimes I see the conflict that is coming up, and I just try to balance it. Yeah, just because they use different words that have different connotations, and
Have to be careful, I think, sometimes. And again, maybe sometimes for you, when you're translating something, you have to stop yourself and think, no, don't say that. It might sound strange, or it might sound a little bit rude, even in the other language.
Yes, that's the most awful part, especially when you're on stage. You're in front of hundreds of people, especially on the opening ceremony or closing ceremony. Yeah, that's the most stressful part of my job.
Wow.
So when it comes to actually teaching students and helping students, what are some strategies, what are some methods that we can use that are going to help students when it comes to translating or interpreting things between languages?
I can suggest a game that we used to play at university, that our teacher gave us to play. Our teacher gave us a sentence, and the first student had to repeat it and translate it. Then the second student would repeat the sentence of the first person, and he was given another sentence. So he had two sentences to repeat and to translate. And the third person, it's called a snowball. And you can imagine the last person that had to repeat like 15 sentences and interpret all of them. And we had a lot of games like that. And we also had a pretty rough game when our teacher asked us something, and if she didn't hear any answer in 10 seconds, she would make us dance some ballet, because she was teaching ballet too. Oh yeah, that was really crazy, but it was really helpful. And
that's
we learned
good to work under pressure, right?
Yes. And we learned not to keep silence. And we had different games on building vocabulary. We would ask questions each other, or interview each other, or we also had to explain a word to a person like he's 5 years old. So we had to explain or describe it like in really easy words. And
That's a good one.
Yeah, she would see if we can explain a word, like what is a microwave? Yeah, and you should explain it. Like it's a box.
I guess that's good, because you might not have the word in a certain language, right? So you need to know how to deal with those situations.
Yes, that's right. She would often give us words that don't exist in another language. Of course, they are related to cultural stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Oh, it just sounds like the message is have fun with it, experiment, make mistakes, and try to learn as you go, and learn to work under pressure, and then you'll start to hopefully get more confident. I think a lot of it comes down to confidence, right? And kind of experimentation.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
That's great.
Great. Wonderful.
So how can our listeners connect with you if they want to find you on Instagram or contact you directly?
They can find me on Instagram. I'm always available 24/7. English and sports. I also have a page on Facebook, but I don't post that much there. But I'm always available on Instagram.
So it's just English in sports, right? That they can find you with.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed our chat. It was great.
Thanks everyone for listening to our episode today.
Yep. As always, remember to subscribe to receive the latest episodes each Wednesday. You can follow us on Instagram at ESL Talk Podcast, or you can send us an email to esltalkpodcast@gmail.com.
Yes, and you can find me and communicate with me directly on Instagram at Learning with Faye. Faye is Fey.
Or I'm Daniel Teacher. That's it for today's episode of ESL Talk. Remember to tune in again next week for another new episode.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe for new episodes and to follow us on Instagram and Facebook for even more ESL teaching content.